And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. We begin today's show with explosive new allegations that the man who gave the Black Panther Party some of its first firearms and weapons training was an undercover FBI informant in California. Richard Aoki was an early member of the Panthers and the only Asian American to have a formal position in the party. He was also a member of the Asian American Political Alliance that was involved in the Third World Liberation Front student strike. The claim that Aoki was informed on his colleagues is based on statements made by a former agent of the FBI in a report obtained by investigative journalist Seth Rosenfeld, author of the new book Subversives, the FBI's War on Student Radicals and Reagan's Rise to Power. Over the last 30 years, Rosenfeld sued the FBI 5 times to obtain confidential records. He eventually compelled the agency to release more than 250,000 pages from their files. In this video, produced by the Center for Investigative Reporting, Rosenfeld explains how he first stumbled across information about Richard Aoki.
A former FBI agent had heard that I was doing research, and he contacted me. His name was Bernie Threadgill. And he says, "Hey, I know that guy." And he said, "Aoki was my informant. I developed him."
Oh, yeah, he was a character. He said, "I don't have any interest in communism." And I said, "Well, why don't you just go to some of the meetings and tell me who's there and what they talked about?" So one thing led to another, and he became a real good informant.
Seth Rosenfeld reports that Aoki may have been covertly filing reports on a wide range of Bay Area political groups, according to the bureau agent who recruited him. He interviewed Aoki twice in 2007 about those allegations. Here's a clip from their phone conversations, which was recorded with Aoki's permission. After you hear Rosenfeld and Aoki, you will hear a comment from former FBI agent Wesley Swearingen.
I'm wondering if you remember a guy named Bernie Threadgill?
Bernie Threadgill?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so.
What I was told in my research that during this period of time you actually worked for the FBI.
They tell you that?
Bernie told me that.
He did?
He did.
Oh, that's interesting.
Informants were used when I was in the FBI. An informant would report on the inner workings of an organization. They can keep you up to date on the thinking of the leadership of the organization, whether it's going this way, that way. Someone like Aoki is perfect to be in a Black Panther Party, because I understand he's Japanese. Hey, nobody's going to guess. He's in the Black Panther Party. Nobody's going to guess that he might be an informant.
That was former FBI agent Wesley Swearingen speaking to reporter Seth Rosenfeld. Many of Richard Aoki's friends and colleagues have expressed shock and disbelief about the claim. We'll talk more about this debate in a minute, but first I want to play one more excerpt from Seth Rosenfeld's interview with Aoki in 2007.
Am I wrong?
I think you are.
Yeah. So, would you say it's untrue that you ever worked with the FBI or got paid by the FBI?
I would say it.
Yeah. And I'm trying to understand the complexities about it, and I think
it is complex.
I believe it is, and
layer upon layer.
Richard Aoki speaking in 2007, 2 years before he committed suicide. Well, for more about these revelations and what they may mean, we're joined by 2 guests. In San Francisco, Seth Rosenfeld is with us, author of Subversives, the FBI's War on Student Radicals and Reagan's Rise to Power. The 734-page book was released Tuesday and took 3 decades to complete. Rosenfeld's was a reporter for the San Francisco Examiner and San Francisco Chronicle for almost 25 years, a winner of the George Polk Award. We'll discuss the rest of his book later. But right now, we're also joined from Santa Barbara, California, California by Diane Fujino, Aoki's biographer and a professor and chair of the Department of Asian American Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She's the author of the recent book Samurai Among Panthers, Richard Aoki on Race, Resistance, and a Paradoxical Life. Her article, Where's the Evidence? Aoki was an FBI informant, appears in today's San Francisco Chronicle. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Seth Rosenfeld, let's begin with you. Where's the evidence?
Good morning. Well, the evidence takes, there's basically 4 pieces of evidence, which I've detailed in my book. The first evidence came when I interviewed Bernie Threadgill in around 2002, 2003. I had met Bernie while I was doing research for my book. As you mentioned, I had obtained thousands of pages of documents from the FBI under the Freedom of Information Act, and as part of my research, I was contacting former FBI agents and reviewing the records with them, and reviewing the records with them to make sure that I understood the records and to elicit further information. So I had met with Bernie several times for over a period of several months and reviewed many documents with him. And then one day we were looking at some documents and Bernie said something like, hey, I know that guy. He was my informant. Bernie had recognized Richard Aoki's name in an FBI document. So Bernie proceeded to tell me how he met Richard Aoki and how he developed him as an FBI informant, and how Richard Aoki became, according to Bernie, one of the best political informants that the FBI had in Northern California in the early 1960s. Well, I had never heard of Richard Aoki before, so while I continued the research on my book, I also began to research who was Richard Aoki, and I read everything I could find about him. I did public records research. I spoke with other people. And then in 2007, I interviewed him on the telephone. With his permission, I tape recorded it. And you've heard the comments he made. He denied being an FBI informant, but he also said, it is complex, layer upon layer. People change. So I interpreted that as, on the one hand, his denial, but on the other hand, an explanation, perhaps, of what I was asking him about. I continued to work on the book, and I was also a reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle at the time. But after Richard Aoki died in 2009, I submitted a Freedom of Information Act request seeking any and all records concerning him. The FBI released approximately 1,500 or 2,000 pages. One of the documents that was released was a 1967 FBI report on the Black Panthers. And this report identified Richard Aoki as an informant. It assigned him the code number T2 for that report. But I still wanted to find out more about it, so I spoke with a former FBI agent named Wesley Swearingen. Mr. Swearingen had been in the FBI for over 25 years. He had retired honorably. He had later become a critic of the FBI's political surveillance, and particularly he had helped vacate the murder conviction of a Black Panther named Geronimo Pratt. So Mr. Swearingen was very familiar with the FBI. He examined this record and other records I had, and he came to the same conclusion I did, which was that Richard Aoki had been an FBI informant in the 1960s. I should add that I did further research in FBI records looking for anything that would be inconsistent, that would challenge my conclusion. And I couldn't find anything that was inconsistent with it, and that's how I reached my conclusion.
Now, Seth Rosenfeld, you also mentioned that despite the fact that Richard Aoki was a very well-known political activist in the third world community in the Bay Area, that there were no FBI files or reports on him as a political activist.
Yes, that's one of the remarkable things about the FBI records that were released on Richard Aoki. Here was a person who had been a member of the Young Socialist Alliance and then an officer in the Young Socialist Alliance. He'd been a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. He'd been a member of the Black Panthers. He'd given guns to the Black Panthers. He'd been a prominent leader in the Third World Strike at Berkeley. And yet, the FBI took the position that it had no files on Richard Aoki himself. The records that were released instead were only about various other organizations that he'd been in, such as the Young Socialist Alliance or the Black Panthers. Based on my experience in reviewing many thousands of pages of FBI records over the years, I found it extraordinary that the FBI would have no main file, as they call it, on Richard Aoki.
Now, Diane Fujino, you have written a biography of Richard Aoki, and of course, in the Bay Area and throughout California, he is known as and revered by many in the progressive movement as a pioneering political activist and revolutionary in the Asian American community. But your response to what the revelations of Seth Rosenfeld?
I was very surprised after I read the San Francisco Chronicle article in Monday's paper. I went, when the book was released on Tuesday, I went to the book. It's a very thick book, 734 pages. There's a tremendous amount of research, and I had expected to find a lot more information detailing this accusation that Aoki was an FBI informant. But when I read the book, I was very surprised that there was little more than what's already been said, than what was said already just this morning on this show. And in my mind as a scholar, I remain open to whatever truth is there, but the evidence needs to be substantial. There needs to meet a certain burden of proof, and it did not in this case. One of the things that Rosenfeld said he has is this one FBI document. I have the same document, also retrieved under the Freedom of Information Act, the 1967 document, and it is the only FBI document that Rosenfeld cites in multiple pages. I had 150 plus pages of documents released to me from the FBI, and in it, it says that a supplementary T symbol, SFT2, was designated for, but the name was left blank. And after that, it is followed in parentheses by Richard Matsui, which is not his middle name, Aoki. But it says after that, for the limited purpose of describing his connections with the organization and characterizing him. And later on that same page, it talks about for the characterization of Richard M. Aoki. So it's unclear whether Aoki is the informant in this case. T symbols are used to refer to informants and also to technical sources of information like wiretaps and microphones. And it's not clear in this case whether Aoki was the informant or whether he was the one being, observed. The second thing is that...
Go ahead, Diane.
The second thing, I wanted to go through the 4 pieces of information that Rosenfeld cites, and all of this is cited in a single footnote in the back. There's no other elaboration beyond this. He says that the former FBI agent, Bernie Threadgill, was the person who gave him this information. But the same bits of information from Threadgill are recited by Rosenfeld, and there's nothing else elaborated upon this. And Threadgill says that he approached Aoki in the late 50s, at a time when Aoki wasn't even political. And he approached Aoki because he overheard Aoki's conversation with a high school classmate. And that classmate's parents were in the Communist Party, apparently, and were under wiretapping surveillance. And it made me think, did this former agent interview or talk to or approach many of this classmate's friends who talked to him on the phone, or was there something about this conversation? And there's just a lot of questions not answered. Swearingen, another former FBI agent, the only piece of information he has besides saying Aoki might be an informant is this idea that because Aoki was Japanese American in the Panthers, that was a perfect place to be an informant. And this makes no sense to me and to many people, because being Japanese American in the Panthers made one stand out, and it aroused suspicion. and it seems the least likely person to be an informant within the Panthers. And that just isn't something that makes sense to me. And the final piece of evidence that Rosenfeld uses is Aoki's own response in the interview. And I think that's ambiguous and open to multiple interpretations. And if you know Aoki, that was classic Aoki in terms of the way he speaks, with allusion, with caution, you didn't see a lot of his wit and humor, but there's a lot of that as well. And I think that it's inconclusive, and yet very definitive statements were drawn from this inconclusive evidence.
Professor Fujino, Aoki said in response to Seth Rosenfeld's question about whether he worked for the FBI, Aoki responded, "It's complex, layer upon layer." Is there a chance he started out with the FBI and changed, or do you see this in a very different way?
Well, I mean, from what is out there on the FBI, it seems like there were many informants in the 60s, and anything is possible. But I don't know. The evidence isn't there for me to be able to make any informed judgment on this. If he did start off as one, this is what I would have liked to have seen before a public charge is made against somebody of this magnitude, is really specific evidence that goes beyond the things that have been said. What was said today, what was in the journal article, the San Francisco Chronicle article, is almost the sum total of what is in the book. There's not much beyond that.
Well, I'd like to bring Seth Rosenfeld back in and respond to this, to Diane Fujino's statement that this is really scant evidence. But I'd also like to ask you, because the interesting thing about police agents or FBI agents, and I'm familiar of having once been in the Young Lords Party, which was under much surveillance by the FBI, that agents tended to be the type of people who or informants tended to be the type of people who said very little but gathered information. And to that sense, Richard Aoki doesn't fit that profile, because he has throughout his political career was known as someone who advanced political theories, was actually very actively involved in shaping the political perspectives and views of the organizations that he was involved in. And to that degree, he doesn't fit the profile of someone who was basically gathering information.
Yes, and another
well, if I can respond to some points that Professor Fujino made, there were a couple misstatements there. What Bernie had told me is that the FBI had a wiretap on the home of some people called the Wachters in the late 50s. The Wachters were members of the Communist Party in the Bay Area at that time. And on that wiretap, they overheard a conversation between their son, Doug Wachter, and Richard Aoki. Doug Wachter and Richard Aoki had been classmates at Berkeley High. After hearing that information, the FBI agent Bernie Threadgill approached Richard Aoki and asked him if he would be an informant. Professor Fujino is correct in stating that at that time in his life, Richard Aoki was not political. In fact, what Bernie Threadgill told me was that Richard Aoki told him he had no interest in communism. And Bernie further said that Richard Aoki became involved in political activities initially at the request of the FBI. Bernie also said that he worked with Richard Aoki as his handler and met with him on a regular basis and received reports from him and paid him, that Richard Aoki provided information on specific groups such as the socialist groups I mentioned, and that after Bernie was transferred to another office in 1965, Richard Aoki was passed along as an informant to another agent. And I should also clarify Wes Swearingen's statement about Richard Aoki being accepted within radical circles, perhaps partly because he was Japanese. That doesn't seem particularly significant now in modern times, but in the late 60s, somebody coming from a different ethnic background made them seem to be an outsider, and there would be less suspicion that an outsider like that would be working for the government, which in those days, certainly the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover was largely all white, almost totally white and male. So I believe that's what Wes Swearingen was referring to. In terms of Richard Aoki's profile, as I mentioned, he starts out not being a political person. He starts attending these meetings. He becomes gradually involved, and it's only later in the 60s that he begins to be more active in advocating different political things.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion. We're speaking with Seth Rosenfeld. His book is published this week, Subversives, the FBI's War on Student Radicals and Reagan's Rise to Power, and Professor Diane Fujino, author of Samurai Among Panthers. And I want, when we come back, Professor Fujino, to ask you about this term you use called snitch jacketing, the government's casting suspicion on the most active activists. Stay with us.